What if the moment that changed George S. Patton's fate forever wasn't on a battlefield, but in a quiet room far from the front lines, where a single warning passed between two presidents, and nothing in the history of World War II was ever quite the same again? It was the autumn of 1945, and the war in Europe had officially ended, but the battles that mattered most were no longer being fought with tanks and artillery. They were being fought with words, with power, with the weight of history pressing down on the shoulders of men who had carried the world through its darkest hours. General George Smith Patton, Jr., the most feared and celebrated battlefield commander the United States Army had ever produced, was standing at a crossroads, not because he had lost a war, but because he refused to stop fighting one. Patton commanded the Third Army. He had liberated cities, broken through enemy lines, and saved thousands of lives with a ferocity and brilliance that left military historians breathless. But now, in the ruins of defeated Germany, Patton was saying things that were making powerful men in Washington very, very nervous. And the warning that would ultimately seal his fate had not yet been delivered, but it was coming. If this kind of story moves you, the kind that happens behind closed doors where history is really made, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. Drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the fall of 1945, the political landscape of post-war Europe was a powder keg. The Soviet Union, once an ally of necessity, was rapidly revealing itself as an ideological empire hungry for expansion. Eastern Europe was falling, country by country, behind what Winston Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. In this climate of shifting alliances and dangerous uncertainties, most American leaders were walking on eggshells around the Soviets, carefully managing the fragile peace that had cost tens of millions of lives to achieve. But George Patton was not most men. In September 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tolz, Bavaria, Patton made a remark that exploded across the headlines of every major newspaper in America. He compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties, as if membership in it had been nothing more than a civic inconvenience. The room went silent. Then it erupted. The backlash was immediate and volcanic. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Patton's commanding officer and longtime colleague, received the full force of that eruption directly. As Supreme Allied Commander and then as military governor of the American Zone in Germany, Eisenhower was responsible for everything happening under his command, including the behavior and statements of the generals who served beneath him. Eisenhower had already warned Patton before. In August 1944, during the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, it had been Eisenhower who shielded Patton from being dismissed outright, understanding that Patton's battlefield genius was irreplaceable during active combat. But this was different. The war was over. The political stakes had shifted entirely. And the warning Eisenhower received in the autumn of 1945 did not come from a newspaper editor or an angry senator. It came from the very top. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, following the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, had inherited a world in transformation. Truman was not a man of grand speeches or theatrical gestures. He was direct, plain-spoken, and possessed of a moral clarity that he wore like armor. He had already made one of the most consequential decisions in human history, the authorization of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Truman understood, better than most, what was at stake in the balance between firmness and recklessness. When Patton's remarks reached the White House, Truman's reaction was unambiguous. He was furious. Not because he lacked admiration for Patton's military record, but because Patton's words were actively undermining the denazification policy that the Allied powers had fought and bled to make possible. The denazification program was one of the most critical and delicate operations of the post-war period. It was designed to systematically remove former Nazi Party members from positions of authority in German society, government, courts, schools, businesses. But Patton, as military governor of Bavaria, had been quietly resisting it. He believed, not without some strategic logic, that many former low-level Nazi members were simply the most competent administrators available, and that removing them entirely would leave a governance vacuum that the Soviets could exploit. To Patton, the real enemy was already the Soviet Union, not a defeated Germany. In private, he had said things that were even more alarming, that the United States should rearm the Germans and march east before the Soviets consolidated their power. These were not idle thoughts. Patton actually believed it. And that was precisely what terrified Washington. When Eisenhower flew to Frankfurt to meet with Patton in person on September 29, 1945, the atmosphere was tense in a way that no military briefing could quite capture. These were two men who had known each other for decades, who had navigated the impossible together, who had argued and reconciled and depended on each other through the most devastating war in history. But Eisenhower arrived carrying more than personal frustration. He arrived carrying the weight of instructions from above, instructions shaped, at least in part, by what Truman had communicated regarding Patton's conduct. Eisenhower told Patton plainly, the press conference comments were indefensible, the denazification resistance was a policy violation, and his position as military governor of Bavaria was no longer tenable. Patton was to be relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to lead the 15th Army, a largely administrative force with no combat role, tasked with writing the history of the war. It was, in all but name, a professional exile. If you're watching this and you can feel the tragedy unfolding, the fall of a great man not to enemy fire but to the politics he despised, then this is the moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with a friend who believes history is more than textbooks. Leave a comment below. Did you know that Patton was removed from command before his death? What surprised you most about this story so far? Patton accepted the reassignment with a bitterness he barely concealed. He wrote in his diary that he felt like he had been stabbed in the back by the very system he had given his life to serve. He spoke to close friends about resigning from the army altogether, returning home, and speaking openly about what he believed was a catastrophic failure of American political will in the face of Soviet aggression. He was 60 years old, still physically powerful, still mentally sharp, but the institution that had defined him had decided it could no longer afford him. The irony was profound and painful. Patton had spent his entire career preparing for war, studying it, living it, breathing it, and now, in the moment when he believed the next great war was already beginning to take shape in the East, he was being handed a pen and told to write about the last one. On December 9, 1945, just as Patton was preparing to return to the United States, likely to resign his commission and enter public life, fate intervened in a way that no political maneuver or military order ever could have. Near Mannheim, Germany, his staff car was struck by a U.S. Army truck. The collision was relatively low speed, but Patton was thrown forward violently, fracturing his third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down. The other passengers in the car were barely injured. In the hospital at Heidelberg, Patton lingered for 12 days. His wife, Beatrice, flew from the United States to be at his side. Doctors attempted everything available to them. But on December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton Jr. died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure, not on a battlefield, not in a blaze of glory, but quietly in a hospital bed in the country he had conquered. The news reached Washington with a strange, complicated silence. Truman, who had not been Patton's admirer in those final months, recognized the weight of what had been lost. A warrior of extraordinary gifts, a man whose flaws were as monumental as his achievements, a figure who had helped save Western civilization and then could not survive the peace that followed. Eisenhower, who had been Patton's reluctant executioner in the professional sense, reportedly received the news with grief he did not easily express. The two men had been locked in a tension that history would spend decades trying to fully understand. The warning Eisenhower had received from Truman's direction, to rein in Patton, to end the public embarrassments, to enforce the policies that the post-war world required, had been acted upon. It had been necessary. And yet it had also been the closing act of one of the most extraordinary military careers in American history. What George Patton said, what Truman communicated, what Eisenhower chose to do with that communication, these are not just footnotes. They are the architecture of a pivotal moment, when the machinery of power confronted the unbending will of a man who saw the world in a way that was simultaneously brilliant and dangerous. History is rarely a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a story of men under impossible pressure, making decisions with consequences they cannot fully see, in the service of a future they are trying imperfectly to build. Patton is buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army he commanded, because he asked to be. Even in death he stayed with his men. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about power, leadership, and the cost of war, then subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who deserves to know the full story. Leave a comment below. What did you learn today that you had never heard before? Your voice keeps this kind of history alive.